Wildlife tourism is an element of many nations' travel industries centered around observation and interaction with local animal and plant life in their natural habitats. Introduction. Wildlife tourism is usually defined within the broad context of nature-based tourism. The term wildlife tourism and nature-based tourism are used interchangeably in the literature primarily because wildlife tourism activities overlap with those of nature-based tourism. Wildlife tourism involves a range of activities such as bird watching, whale watching, snorkeling, general wildlife viewing, game hunting, recreational fishing, and visiting zoos and aquaria. Some authors argue that viewing captive and semi-captive animals may be considered nature-based but not necessarily classified as ecotourism when artificial animal feeding and human independence are emphasized. According to Ryan and Saward, 2004, zoos that simulate the natural habitats of wildlife may be considered ecotourism destinations. Generally, wildlife tourism is considered a form of ecotourism if managed in accordance with the principle of sustainable development. Wildlife in the context of tourism. Historically, wildlife species were associated mostly with certain game species, almost exclusively birds, mammals, and fish, that people hunt. The members of the European ruling class or royalty who explored the savannas of Africa and later the rainforests of America and Asia to hunt wild. Definitions of wildlife tourism. Wildlife tourism involves encounters with non-domesticated animals either in their natural environment or in captivity. Wildlife tourism includes all forms and scales of tourism that involve the enjoyment of natural areas and wildlife. Wildlife-based recreation can occur on public, private, or communal land. Wildlife tourism can entail attractions at fixed sites, tourist experiences available in association with tourist accommodation, or it can occur unguided encounters by independent travelers. Wildlife tourism is undertaken to view and/or encounter wildlife. It can take place in a range of settings, from captive, semi-captive to in the wild, and it encompasses a variety of interactions from passive observation to feeding and/or touching the species viewed. Concepts and principles. Animals as troopists enjoy hunting expeditions during the early 18th century. Likewise, hunting grounds in some parts of central Russia during the pre-Soviet period were under the control of the royalties and aristocrats, who allegedly were partly responsible for the local extinction of large species in the region. During this era, animal trupes were kept in private collections or sold to circuses and menageries. Today, the term wildlife includes all living forms, even those that are not used for sport or non-game species. Tourism literature usually restricts wildlife to the animal kingdom, more specifically to vertebrates or animals with backbones. Wild animals, in contrast to its domesticated counterpart, have genetic and behavioral characteristics selected over time by adaptive evolution, rendering them suited to their natural environments. Many of these biological and psychological features have disappeared because of genetic homogenization through selective breeding for domestication and utilitarian reasons. From the tourism industry perspective, wildlife is typically associated with relatively large and attractive vertebrates because of their charismatic appeal to tourists. Even though wildlife is usually associated with free-roaming animals. It also pertains to wild animals to keep under captive or semi-captive conditions, either within or outside their natural habitats. However, animals in contrived or man-made environments, especially those born in captivity, develop human-dependent behavior and do not necessarily attract discerning tourists who prefer a more authentic encounter with animals in the wild. Paradoxically, the animals commonly promoted in wildlife tourism constitute to the majority of the species considered threatened with extinction by the World Conservation Union or IUCN Red Book of 2011. Thus, efforts to manage them, even those inhabiting areas outside protected reserves, are urgent and necessary. Wildlife tourism, a recreational pursuit. Tourist interactions will, with wildlife in recreational pursuits may be non-consumptive or consumptive. Consumptive use of wildlife for recreation involves the capture of or killing of target animals in the form of a. Recreational hunting of game species. Example are waterfowl and big game, which may also be used as food. Letter B. Recreational fishing. Examples fish may be released if not used as food. And C. Trophy hunting and fishing. Examples animals whose bodies or body parts are preserved as trophies as a reminder of the thrill of hunting. Licensed hunters claim that professional sport hunting or collecting threatened wildlife species in and off parks is prohibited, including all other forms of native animals in protected areas or Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act or Republic Act Number 9147 or 2001. Non-consumptive wildlife tourism is a fast-growing sector of the tourism industry in which recreational activities are undertaken with no deliberate intent to catch or kill or interfere with wildlife. It encompasses a range of recreational activities such as wildlife watching, video recording, and photography. Wildlife watching includes tourist interactions with animals in captive conditions. Examples are zoos, aquariums, and aviaries. Semi-captive conditions. Examples wildlife parks, dolphin pens, or natural setting. Example natural parks, migratory routes, breeding sites.
The core elements of non-consumptive wildlife tourism under different recreational setting. There are four core elements which is focal wildlife species, human interference, I mean human interference, and tourist wildlife interactions and types of tourists. Focal wildlife species types and diversity of species or groups of species. The captive setting is a selection of species usually large, charismatic, endangered, and rare. Semi-captive settings, a combination of selected and habituated species, usually large, charismatic, mobile, and sociable. Natural settings is a diversity of native species on small to large aggregates mixed natural population. Animal adaptability. The, com- the captive settings is adaptive to captive condition and management interventions. The semi-captive is adaptable to semi-captive condition, can easily habituate to humans. Natural settings less tolerant to human interference. Animal movement. The captive settings is restricted, the semi-captive is semi-restricted, and the natural settings is free roaming. Animal welfare or rights issues. The captive settings is high, the semi-captive is low to moderate, and the natural setting is low to nil. Human and the second core element is human interference. Built environment or infrastructures. The captive setting is many, the semi-captive is few to moderate, and the natural setting is few to nil. Ability to enforce rules or control. The captive setting is strong, the semi-captive is moderate to strong, and the natural setting is weak. Educational and interpretive programs. The captive setting is major or mostly factual, and the semi-captive is moderate or factual and interpretive, and the natural setting is minor to nil. Educational value of focal species at different biodiversity levels. The captive setting is individual level to high and species level to moderate and ecosystem level to low. And the semi-captive setting is individual level to moderate to high, species level to high, and ecosystem level to moderate to high. Natural settings and the individual level to low and species level to high and ecosystem level to high. The third core elements, which is tourist wildlife interactions. Effort to see or observe wildlife, the captive setting is easy, the semi-captive is easy to moderately difficult, and the natural setting is difficult, more time involved. Nature or animal tourist interactions. The captive settings is contrived or relaxed, and semi-captive is moderately contrived and guarded, and the natural setting is authentic and extremely cautious. Tourist expectations. Captive settings is purposive. The semi-captive is more purposive than incidental, and the natural setting is incidental to purposive. Risk to safety of tourists. The captive setting is null to low, the semi-captive is low to moderate, and the natural setting is high. Relative certainty of encounter. The captive setting is certain, the semi-captive is uncertain, and the natural setting is extremely uncertain. Environmental ethics being evoked. The captive setting is anthropocentric scientific, and the semi-captive is anthropocentric scientific and naturalistic, and the natural setting is naturalistic ecocentric. Level of site impact or ecological. The captive setting is low, the semi-captive is low to moderate, and the natural setting is moderate to high. Social implication to local community. The captive setting is nil to low, and the semi-captive is low to moderate, and the natural setting is moderate to high. And the fourth core element is type of tourist. So the captive settings is mass tourists and general interest group usually require support facilities for comfort and leisure. The semi-captive setting is usually small and species interest groups may require specialist service, may be willing to pay more for the experience. The natural setting is small species interest group may require specialist service, may be willing to pay more for a more focused wildlife encounter. The low budget explorer may include trekkers and some bird watchers. Wildlife as a focal species. Flagship or charismatic. A wild animals that are large, attractive and rare. Focusing only a few animals. They called wildlife animals as a flagship because they evoke sympathy from the public and can be powerful and effective symbols in conservation and fundraising campaigns. Godwin and later Williams 2000. They noted the conservation priorities towards big and charismatic mammals are evident in many protected areas frequented by tourists. So, in tourism marketing, flagship species is seen as an effective strategy in raising conservation awareness. The raising conservation awareness and enhancing public education about the species. So, each wildlife species has ecological niche preferences for feeding, breeding, and roosting. So, species with broad niche requirements tend to be widely distributed and may be observed more often. So examples are monkey and several species of wetland birds. The predictable areas is water holes, feeding ground, and cave migrator. However, tourists concentrating on these areas can disturb the animals, especially when they are breeding or nesting. Examples are the Philippine eagle and several rare and endemic species in the Philippines. Tourists who prefer to see rare and solitary species in the wild may have to plan for a longer stay outdoors. Viewing wildlife in natural settings cannot be guaranteed. Consequently, wildlife animals are either induced by some tour operator to congregate in a relatively more accessible location or maintained in wildlife parks of viewing. So several hotels and ecologists and tour operators in the Philippines develop wildlife tourism products comprising of wildlife viewing in restrictive semi-captive or captive condition. Visiting legitimate zoo organization is one way to guarantee wildlife viewing despite the artificial nature of the sittings. Many zoos worldwide are located in urban areas which are accessible to and popular with millions of tourists. Examples are San Diego Zoo, Safari Park, National Zoological Park, and Hoggle Zoo, and etc. So, tourist wildlife interactions impacts on wildlife. Among many factors contributing to recreational impacts in the behavior or attitude of the tourist toward the wildlife. So there are the consequences of tourist wildlife interaction are complex and dynamic. Types of wildlife reaction is frequency and intensity of disturbance. The growing popularity of wildlife tourism has raised major concern because of the short-term and long-term impacts of recreation of wildlife and their habitats.
So, in this topic, 6.3 lists the identified wildlife bioecological characteristics that are negatively impacted by non-consumptive tourism. The early response of wildlife typically consists of mortality, drastic changes in behavior and stored energy levels, abandoning of nest and feeding locations, and other reactions. It is increasingly understood that non-consumptive wildlife tourism can have negative effects on animals while being thought of as being generally harmless. For instance, wildlife observers who watch from a safe distance may not bother the animal as much as wildlife photographers who prefer to get a closer look. A Florida Wildlife Refuge tourism impact analysis revealed that among the area's recreational users, wildlife photographers are the most obtrusive. So according to Klein 1993, despite being seen as relatively harmless, non-consumptive wildlife tourism can really have a negative influence on animals. For instance, compared to a wildlife viewer, wildlife photographers who want to get a closer look at animals can disrupt wildlife more. According to our research on the effects of tourism at a Florida Wildlife Refuge, wildlife photographers are the most disruptive users of the area. Animals in the wild that frequently interact with people become accustomed by kissing to react to predictable and benign disturbance. Both benefits and drawbacks can come with habit. Animals do not need to expend energy attempting to flee the disturbance, which is favorable. The viewing opportunities for tourists can be increased because animals don't pay attention to human presence. So next, but not all types of wildlife can easily get used to people. Many people find it intolerable when tourists are around, especially when they are pregnant or breastfeeding. Animals that are not accustomed to human presence are typically sensitive to it. If allowed in this situation, travelers feeding wildlife should be closely supervised by park authorities. According to Orams in 2002, artificial feeding of wildlife and visitors has a variety of detrimental repercussions. So in this table, as you can see, this is the summary of the adverse impacts of non-consumptive wildlife tourism on single species or groups of species. There are two columns here. The first column is the affected bioecological traits of wildlife. The second is the impacts in short terms and long term. And letter A, the direct impact. Feeding pattern. It is a disruption while feeding and the abandonment of gills, shift in foraging distribution patterns. Breeding pattern is a disruption during territorial defense. Courtship, nesting, nursing, brooding, breakdown of parent offspring, bonding, reduced reproductive rate and fecundity, low reproductive success. Social behavior pattern. It is a breakdown of social bonding, disruption of territoriality, and predator relationships, and etc. The natural predation and competition, increased exposure to enemies, higher predation of young and eggs because of abandonment by parents, reduced energy and fat storage needed to escape predation, displacement of sensitive individuals to marginal habitats. Next, the physiological response. It is a high incidence of stress-related disease and transmitted disease. Example is the pneumonia, measles, and tuberculosis. So, survivorship is a frequent roadkill, destruction of nest, high mortality rate, especially in young population. The population dynamics. It is a population decline and displacement of sensitive species, population increase and colonization of more resistant and persistent species. Letter B, the indirect impact habitats and ecological. Example is the feeding, breeding, nesting, lofting, roosting, leaning, and etc. It is a vegetation, trampling, soil compaction and erosion, alteration of vegetation, composition, and structure. Range or a landscape. It is a change of landscape because of the introduction of infrastructures and artificial wildlife and amenities. Examples the feeding trays, water holes. Pro- proliferation of trucks and trails, increased vehicular traffic, mutilation of trees for firewood, introduction of aliens, invasion habitats, pre- fragmentation, increased age effects, decline in biological diversity, water, and land. Next is the wildlife souvenirs and curious. It is an illegal collection and transport of wildlife and wildlife byproducts carrying of fossils sites. Next is tourist wildlife interaction disease transmission. It is a significant issue with intimate contact in wildlife tourism is this disease transmission, particularly vulnerable to human disease are dolphins and primates. Some diseases are known to have been carried by domestic and feral animals and transmitted to wild species. These pathogens have the potential to cause the local extinction of wild populations. Last is for wildlife tourists, seeing wild animals and visiting less frequented natural areas are the two main tourism attractions. The overall experience of wildlife tourism includes viewing wildlife in its native habitats, getting up and personal with a broad variety of animals, and exchanging experiences with other travelers who share your interest.
Wildlife tourists often show great sense of appreciation and wonderment from watching or even just hearing wildlife in their nature habitats, in addition to the excitement they feel for being in an unfamiliar nature setting. The following traits were found in profile of the majority of the inbound wildlife tourists who were polled in Australia in 2001. First-time visitors are interested in seeing iconic marsupials, kangaroo, and koala. Return visitors are interested in seeing other types of animals. Male tourists are interested in seeing wild animals like crocodile, shark, snake, parrot, penguin, lizard, fish, turtle, and seal. Young tourists usually travel as couples or with friends. Wildlife tourists tend to stay longer, visit more regions than another tourist, and visit regions outside the international gateways. Wildlife tourists spend less on a daily basis, although their overall expenditures are high because of the longer stay. The main purpose of the first visit is to holiday rather than visit friends and relatives or to conduct business. The majority of wildlife tourists are from Europe, Japan, and South Korea. According to Curtin, 2005, the experimental aspect of wildlife tourism are linked to the tourist entocentric and anthropomorphic example, transposing human societal values onto animals, attraction to animals, and the human inherent desire to interact with and interpret animal behavior. It is unclear what drives travelers to see wildlife. Seeing wild animals that visiting less congested nature areas are, in general, the key tourism experience desired by wildlife visitors. Important components of the entire wildlife tourism experience including seeing wildlife in its nature habitats, getting up and personal with a wild variety of animals, and exchanging experience with the other travelers who share your interest. Further state that the experience in nature and watching wildlife are potentially fundamental to human mental health and happiness, that the very existence of wildlife enhances our lives. Benefits from wildlife tourism. Tourism benefits are often measured in economic terms based on earnings from employment, accommodation, transport, and secondary commercial industry. The revenue from big game in Africa supports the management of parks and provides local community incentives to conserve wildlife. Wildlife tourism in protected areas can help finance biodiversity conservation. However, strong reliance on tourism revenue for wildlife protection may result in a shift away from biodiversity conservation when government support for protected areas is diminishing. The benefits of wildlife tourism are also expressed in terms of the whole recreational experience rather than the economic value placed on the particular species. While some wildlife species can pay for their own conservation through game viewing, sport hunting, game cropping, and ranching, other species do not have direct economic value. Conservation is often superseded by the economic demands driven by short-term recreational values placed on wildlife and nature. Some tour operators, especially those involved in ecotourism, claim that they create conservation awareness through their various environmental education and interpretation initiatives. The satisfaction derived from viewing and learning about wildlife lends support to deeper environmental and conservation awareness. Conclusion: there are many different traits, qualities, and experience offered by wildlife tourism. The diverse characteristics of animals provide a wide range of perspectives and opportunities for leisure, conservation, and resource of management in both natural and man-made contexts. The sustainability of wildlife tourism is difficult to discern because of the dynamic nature of wildlife as well as the complexity of tourism engagement of wild animals over time. Long-term monitoring of tourism impacts is essential in order to sustain wildlife tourism. Adaptive measures are needed to address issues resulting from the monitoring program. Among the sustainability concerns in wildlife tourism are the following: visiting in fragile areas where biodiversity is high, visiting in fragile areas where local economy is low, potential and real impacts of tourism on focal and non-focal species, group of species and their habitats, adverse impacts or close encounters with rare and threatened wildlife in fragile ecosystems, conflicts between alternative uses of wildlife between tourists and local hunters, conflicts in the regulation of wildlife utilization, example, Western and customary law, increasing pressure to raise revenue through tourism for protected areas, conservation management, and biodiversity. Tourism bias to a few protected areas with high wildlife attraction, resulting in concentration of impacts and limited distribution of tourism benefits. Lack of genuine involvement of local communities in tourism planning and management. Absence of equitable and transparent system of sharing tourism and benefits. Perceiving conflicts role of zoos including other captivate and semi-captivate setting and biodiversity conservation. And that will be all. Thank you for listening throughout my presentation.